in U.S. Health Research. My name is Michelle Bolas. I'm Executive Vice President and Chief Innovation Officer for NCInnovation. NCInnovation is a public-private partnership in North Carolina that focuses specifically on advancing academic research from prototype to pre-commercial readiness. We are endowed by the state of North Carolina with a $500 million endowment. We distribute that through grants and in support of regional networks that allow public universities outside of RTP, where there's so many wonderful resources, to also move the discoveries, inventions, and technologies from their institutions forward. I am thrilled to be here today with this group. So it's really fun. You often get these conversations in isolation where you're talking about research, you're talking about the regulatory environment, you're looking at what's happening with the private sector, but it's fairly rare to have all of that come together in one conversation. So I hope you enjoy this as much as I do. We'll have some time at the end for questions, and one of our panelists, Robert Califf, is going to join us here probably in about 15 minutes or so. Flight delays, I think, are just part of our life right now as a society. So I'm going to ask these two to introduce themselves, and then we'll get started.
Okay. So hi, I'm Penny Gordon-Larsen. I'm a professor at the university, and I'm also the Vice Chancellor for Research. And so what that means is that I oversee the strategy and compliance and development of research at the university. I'm the Chief Scientific Officer for the university.
My name is Scullion. I'm the CEO of a company called Atlas Clinical Research. We're a clinical research site network business based in the United States. Previously spent about 20 years in the industry in pharma and CRO. Most importantly, I used to work here at UNC. That was probably the best job I ever had.
Thank you. And Robert, when he joins us, is currently at Duke, but former commissioner and head of the FDA, so really bringing that regulatory environment perspective to the conversation, which is really important. If you were here for the opening of the session this morning, Jimmy led a great panel on just overall disruption, and from the global perspective to the local perspective right here in RTP, some of the major shifts that are happening as we look to accelerate research and innovation into new discoveries and really see those get to a place of impact in patients' lives. But that really all starts with a very healthy and robust research environment, which North Carolina has been blessed with over many years, $13.3 billion in annual research yield in the state, and a lot of that translated into drug development, into discoveries, into therapeutic pathways that have really made a difference in patients' lives. So we really have a rich environment, but we're not immune to those disruptions. So I think starting at the research level with you, Penny, what of the things that are happening now, both in the country and globally, where would you like to start?
It's been quite I mean, it feels like more than a year, but it's only been since January. We've had, some real serious disruptions to the federal research infrastructure in the U.S. And so this has really been, from a couple of different directions. One has been just agency disruptions in the types and amount of research funding that the agencies are supporting, but also in some of the infrastructure that it's the indirect cost support, which you've probably heard a lot about. The indirect cost support is the support for the facilities and administration of grants that happens when you receive money from the federal government. And so that money that you receive is over and above the grant that supports the science. And so it supports the infrastructure to carry out the science. And so there's been a discussion at the federal level about capping the F&A costs to 15%. And right now, all institutions have an individual institutional federally negotiated rate. Ours is 55.5%, and the delta between 15 and 55.5% is about $125 million a year that we would not have to support the research enterprise. So we're just one of many institutions. All institutions are dealing with this right now, but it's a very significant change, and there is reform underfoot. I'm on the national committee that is working on that reform, but we will find out soon what happens with that, where we wind up in terms of covering those costs. But if it were to go through without additional changes, it would have a really big impact on our capability to carry out research in the U.S.
Very big hit to the business model currently of federally funded research. So we'll put a pin in that and come back to it because that's a really important conversation. I want to ask the same question of you, Mark. What are you seeing as kind of from the clinical trial perspective, where are the biggest shifts in terms of the disruptions that we're seeing?
So just as Penny said, the last 12 months have been quite impactful, but we almost need to wind it back more than that. So there's COVID and there's pre-COVID. But even pre-COVID, large pharma was giving some thought to, not just large pharma, but the pharma industry generally, about portfolio prioritization. What would they do? They were thinking through the consequences of the IRA on their commercialization model. Then COVID hit. Post-COVID, you get supply chain shocks globally. That impacts portfolio. We're just about getting through that when we enter an election cycle. It scarcely matters who the election cycle centers on, but that there is one, as Jimmy in the panel said this morning, there is uncertainty. When there's uncertainty, that breeds difficulty of planning and decision making. So coming into this year, with all of the changes at the federal level that Penny's referencing, we see all of that in commercial research. Maybe there are fewer studies. Pharma takes decisions longer. The investments that they're having to make in the United States to account for the possibility of impact on tariffs, for example, means that money has to come out of other budgets, which maybe they would have put into portfolio management and development. But in the very short term, at the very least, it causes them to think differently about whether they do something or they don't. So for the likes of us, who are downstream of commercial research, how many studies are going to get run? Will they start on time? Will they be the same size? What kind of budget pressure is there? So for us to run the same sort of study that we would have done last year, maybe they're going to put more where they are, putting more pressure on the budgets. I think the last thing I'll note as well, and this isn't necessarily only about vaccines, but it does have an impact on public trust. So there was a period of about 18 months during COVID where finally people that in my life understood my job, sort of. My parents never really knew what I did. What do you do? You a doctor? I'm not a doctor. So what do you do in medical research? But everyone understood clinical trials. And for that brief golden moment from about March 2020 until about December of 2021, we were superheroes. And that moment passed. So there's an impact on public trust, which means at the very technical level, people who work in our clinics are having to spend more time explaining to patients or actually answering questions. Is this real? Is this safe? I mean, even this week, we've got a flu study that's running, and patients are coming in and asking, is this mRNA? They don't know what mRNA is, but they're worried that if they have it, it's going to be impactful to them. And I think it's going to take us a while to figure out what impact there is on public trust in the long term. Certainly for us, there is in the short term, just in bringing people in, especially from underrepresented communities, to feel confident that this is something in which they should participate.
So listening to both of you, and then referencing back to the opening panel again, it really strikes me that there's this tension between the increasing pace and speed of technology development, and really what society is demanding, and then the drag on the actual production of those things that are potentially transformational. which makes strategy and decision-making, discernment so much more important. So how do you think about looking across a huge research portfolio like Chapel Hill? How do you think about where then to make those investments, and what role does thinking about speed versus impact, all of those factors play in that decision making?
Yeah, so I mean, I'm very bullish on research, even though I think we're in a moment that's very frustrating. I think that I actually would like to back up to why we have the federal investment in research and the partnership with universities and institutes of research, and how that helps industry is that, after coming out of World War II, the country made a decision to invest in a research ecosystem, and that research ecosystem is the partnership between the universities and the federal government to create the opportunities and discoveries that fuel tomorrow's products. And so when we think about research, we have to think about the long trajectory of what's in that pipeline, because it takes a lot of discoveries and a lot of failures to get to something that is viable to go to market. And so when we're thinking about investments in the future and efficiency and speed, we have to think not just about next year, but what is the 20-year landscape? Because when we invest in the laboratories, when we invest in the technologies, we're investing in that early stage pipeline to feed industry down the road. And so we can think about things like AI and speeding, potentially speeding the efficiency of getting those discoveries out into clinics, getting them translated as rapidly as possible. But, they have to be very wise and smart and used appropriately. And so it takes a lot of thinking about how we deploy these new technologies and how we use them to the best of our capabilities to do things right, to provide the right evidence base, to provide the right strategies, and to provide the right mechanisms to get those discoveries out. And so we spend a lot of time right now, spending a lot of time thinking about our clinical trials platforms and our basic science, discovery science, which is just so critical for the next 20-year, 50-year landscape, is what we're doing now in the discovery sciences, the basic sciences. And by basic sciences, I don't just mean wet lab, but some of the dry lab work and the very technical work in some of the development of the technologies that we're seeing right now, making them better.
Great, thank you. Sticking with that for just one more question. As a follow-up, you referenced the clinical trial readiness, and embedded within that are partnerships and kind of increasing that partnership model with the private sector. As more of that shifts to bringing in industry earlier into that pipeline development, what do you see as opportunities or threats there?
Yeah, there's huge opportunities for these partnerships. I mean, I think one of the big issues right now that we're struggling with, not just us at UNC, but really I think just in general, is the ownership of data. And data are some of our biggest assets at this university in particular, but at many universities across the world, not just across the U.S. But what we want to do is be able to partner with industry to get the therapies and strategies out into the public domain as rapidly as possible, but without the massive, it's so expensive, the AI and the electronic, everything that we're doing in this space is so incredibly expensive that we can't shoulder the burden ourselves. And so when we partner with industry, we want to partner in industry in ways that benefit industry and benefit us and benefit our patients, but that don't compromise the value that we have here at the institution for those data, but also the value of the data to society. And so these are really thorny issues to navigate, incredible opportunities for us to do things that benefit society in innumerable ways and reach parts of the public that are underserved. So it's really important that we do it, but it's a balancing act to figure it all out.
So Mark, taking the private sector clinical research lens to that same question, what is it that you're thinking about in terms of strategy as you get deeper into those research partnerships with academic or other nonprofit research institutions?
So I'll start here where Penny ended about data ownership and data size. I've been in the industry just about 20 years, and I've developed this belief that even very good large companies, it's not really their core competence to do data innovation and technology innovation. They can try it. But the best of that comes from smaller, more disruptive, focused innovation companies. The challenge that we have is that they don't necessarily understand our industry completely and don't necessarily understand the constraints of our industry completely. So that's then some of the balance that Penny's referencing, is we want to get these innovations. We want to do them quickly and at scale. But we don't necessarily want to, at least I wouldn't want to, spin those groups up inside. When I used to work at IQVIA or at Novartis, we think we're great at it, but frankly not. It's much better to partner with somebody from the outside. So just to make it more concrete, the last 12, 18 months, AI is everywhere. Right? 5, 10 years ago, everyone talked about RPA. Now it's AI. But I was speaking to somebody just a couple of months ago who leads development operations at a top 5 pharma. And what she said was, she's about my age, so she's pretty old. She said 2 years ago, if somebody would said to her AI was important, she'd have rolled her eyes and said, okay, fine, it's the next thing. But now, she's mandating that all of our teams have some ongoing projects. The balance then is something that Jeannie said earlier this morning, don't ideate too much. You shouldn't have so many things going on. It's like any scientific experiment. If you have too many variables, you don't really know how to answer the question. So what we're trying to do in a relatively smaller company is find applications for AI which are truly of use. So does it help someone? How much does it help? And how will we know that it did? But then also in analyzing these vendor companies in a way of, do you understand your liabilities when you get into this with us? And they don't. So we're trying to somewhat educate them. So something fairly simple, as about as straightforward as it can be. Making calls to patients to see whether they would like to participate in a study. If they have previously indicated an interest in participating in a study, so there's not even really that much data privacy, but making that call to them with an AI agent. So some of what we have to look for is the maintenance of their data, the potential leakage of their data, and when that starts to interact with a large pharma company or a CRO, how does that then feed into their data? And the liability shield that they need is considerable, because for very good reason, and you see data breaches all the time, from Netflix, from AT&T, from whatever. If there's a data breach which causes the interruption or disruption of clinical trial data, which maybe prevents, delays, or eliminates the ability to submit that study, that company is ended. For good reason, because it's a data privacy issue. So what we're trying to do, just in summation, is innovate, yes, be thoughtful about the applications of those innovations which truly drive meaningful improvements, but also trying to make sure the things which, quite frankly, I don't understand completely, we can apply without risking patient safety data, patient privacy, and also, finally, the financial safety of my company and anyone that works with us.
So how much of the acceleration in terms of the speed that you're seeing both in the research and the clinical trial space is driven by market pressures, and how much is driven by the emergence of China and other Far East competitors in terms of the investments that they're making in the space?
So Professor Hugh O'Neill would have said the answer to that is yes. So it's all of the above. There's always the market pressure. So if you're in a pharma environment, you might be in a competitive race. But even if you're not, you know that the commercial profile of that asset is a function of how long you can have exclusivity. So the quicker you can get to the market. So that's always there. As the panel referenced this morning, it used to be that, I wouldn't say the US quite had an open lane, but had more of an open lane. There are now more entrants. China's just one, but it's a significant one. So that's that. And as you get more technological innovation, then there's that pressure to bring it in so that you can achieve the other two things tendency, maybe I'd be interested in thoughts on it. We have a tendency as an industry to say, we don't really do much. Things don't really change. That looks a lot like it did 10 years ago, 15 years ago. But I would probably take the contra position that we've actually innovated tremendously, even in my relatively short time in this business. We have made a lot of gains. Things are a lot better. I think we're going to have, and I apologize for the cliche, there's probably going to be a step change, though, in the next 18 months, 3 years, that application of processing technology and all of the competitive pressures that you reference will really see us push forward a lot quicker and establish a new baseline. So it's all of the above, I think, Michelle. But we really do have a moment, you know, from your optimism. I think we have a moment to really get much better at this if we grasp the opportunity.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I think also where we have made a lot of progress that we don't really talk about is in some of the methods, the statistical methods and the ability to rapidly identify patient populations, to do clinical trials that are really, really efficient. And we saw that through COVID, the pressure of COVID that helped with that. But, you know, this kind of work has been going for a while, and there's platform work for cyber infrastructure to create access to molecular genetic data more rapidly than we ever have before. That is moving us more towards a personalization of therapies as well. And so the drug discovery, the AI, you know, a lot of these methods sometimes are, you know, they aren't viewed as really the technological part of what we do, but we're investing a lot in those kinds of methodologies. And the federal government has, you know, they've been there to help us with that. And in some respects, I think we still lead in many of these kinds of careful analytical approaches that can be sometimes leveraged to save costs as opposed to being, you know, incredibly expensive. Everybody thinks, oh, it's got to be super expensive and highly technical. And yes to the technical, but not always to the expensive.
Switching a little bit to thinking about future workforce and the importance of that for the field overall. You referenced in your opening remarks the cuts to F&A rates and what that means for our ability not only to fund basic infrastructure and all of the technology that it takes and the expertise, but really to train up that next generation of professionals. Where are you seeing the biggest impacts and cuts to PhD programs, to really in the labs, that workforce that really drives the university research environment?
Yeah, it's such a good question. It's that's one of the more worrisome things. I mean, not just the budget cuts, but also the perception that it's not a good career path. And that worries me a lot because, you know, we have benefited so much from these training programs. And I think one of the problems with research in the United States, the way we talk about research in the United States, is that we haven't really tied together the academics and the research. These missions are often different on college campuses, where you talk about the teaching mission, the teaching enterprise, and you talk about the research enterprise as separate, but really they're quite intertwined. And what attracts students to universities like UNC is the fact that we've got the latest technologies, we've got the latest equipment, we've got all of these cutting-edge research that are federally funded that allow students the hands-on work that gives them the skills that makes them really highly marketable when they graduate, whether they're graduating as an undergrad or a graduate student. But the problem is that if it's not viewed as part of the teaching mission, that you're not getting the advocacy that you would get, and you're not understanding the impact that you do get when you pull back those federal dollars. And this is, you know, this kind of training that we do through funded research really does prepare the workforce. If you're doing cutting edge research and the students have their hands in the cutting edge research, they leave here just incredibly prepared for the workforce. And that is why we have, you know, the biopharma and biotech industry here, industry locates here because they want access to our talent to be able to employ them so that they can ramp up and move things faster too. And so it's part of that World War II investment in that partnership and a key part of the economic development that makes North Carolina a biotech leader. And so when you cut off the federal funding, the trickle-down effects of all of that are pretty extraordinary. And it's hard to feel it right away, but it is, I think, the most dangerous aspect of the cuts to federal funding.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's felt more quickly than maybe we realize, but I would ask Mark, if you're already seeing, this is your innovation talent pipeline, right? If you're already seeing impacts on the workforce side from a clinical trial perspective.
I think I'd have to say we're not quite yet. It's maybe too soon quite for that, Michelle, but it's, I mean, you go look right now. If you were to, I think Penny's absolutely right when you look at the location here. If you were to just go and do an Indeed search for positions in clinical research, even if in just the state, and look at what they ask for. They're going to ask for a postdoc. They're going to look for an MSc, at least an undergraduate in some scientific or related, most of the time. And if those opportunities aren't there, particularly for PhDs and postdocs to do that work, then evidently the talent pipeline is thinner, and that has an impact. It might take a while. It might be a 5-year, 10-year generational shadow. We might not know how long it's going to take. There's no real surprise. And when you look at here, we have significant amount of investment in our industry. Why? We've got Duke, we've got Carolina, we've got NC State, we've got Elon. And you look around the world, where is it? In the UK, it's Cambridge, big university. And also here we have Boston, biotech hub. Why? Universities all over the place. When you go to Europe, places like Basel, large biotech sector centered around universities. The correlation's fairly obvious. So if you cut research, however you want to frame it, whether it's a cut in overheads, cut in grants, universities don't work like that, where there's just a box, unless it's an endowment. Most of the time, in a smokier world than mine, the money is the money. And if the money gets cut, there are things that can't happen, and it has to get redeployed. So if you do that, there is going to be less impact. There's going to be less opportunity, which is going to cause an impact on talent pipelines. It's absolutely going to affect people like us. What it will mean also for us in the short term is we're going to have to be more creative about how we hire. And I don't know, maybe it makes us less effective if we can't hire the same sort of people with the same level of experience. So we're not quite there yet, but I don't think it's going to take very long for us to feel it.
Since it doesn't look like Robert is going to make it from the airport, I'd really love to hear both of you comment on what cuts and changes at the regulatory agencies and that intersection with the funding agency cuts, what that means for both of your worlds.
Well, in the whole regulatory domain, the not necessarily cuts per se, but the talent there in the agencies has really been disrupted. So a lot of very talented people in the regulatory agencies are no longer there. And when they are no longer there, either there are people who don't have the history to understand, they will make the same mistakes that have been made but not remembered. And it also just makes things very inefficient. And so there's a huge inefficiency that we're seeing in the agencies, which is problematic. The challenge is that the regulatory domain and burden on research is extraordinary, and it's very expensive. When we, as there are more and more regulations that are thrown at universities, thrown at not just universities, but any federal funding. And a lot of it is, really necessary for security and other purposes. But they've been layering on, conflicting policies and, export control. All of these things are very, very complicated. And so we have to hire people that are very skilled and are very expensive. And so it makes it a very challenging thing to carry out. And so there's inefficiencies all around and expenses all around. And if we can't afford to support the regulatory team internal to the university in response to the burden imposed on us, then we can't accept federal funding.
Sounds like a lot of those
Yes.
changes are really being pushed down
Yes.
to ground level.
Yes.
Where the research starts, and putting a heavier burden on the time of increasing
Yes.
increasing cuts.
And I think the challenge in DC right now is that, like the Office of Management and Budget, who's in charge of a lot of this stuff, they understand some of this, but without working in an academic institution and really firsthand understanding this, they don't understand all of the, they want to reduce the regulatory burden. Like that is a goal for them, but what is actually happening is not helping us in that respect. And so we've got to get through a lot of this, and hopefully some of the desire to cut regulatory burden will actually happen and we can be more efficient. So I'm holding out hope on that.
No, I agree with Penny. I think the institutional memory is very important. We've said all morning at each of the sessions about how there's more innovation, there's more technology, we're doing far more cross-in-class, cross-indication treatments and assets than we ever did before, at a time where, at least here, we're reducing the number of people who have expertise that might be able to actually get through approvals of these properly, understand what those data are. And as Penny said too, it changes in methods, statistical methods, but also the way in which trials are designed, rather than it being simple 1, 2, 3, combination trials, adaptive trials. And if you have fewer people who really understand those, particularly relative to, I would say, competing regulatory agencies, then that also makes pharma reconsider allocation of patients. Would we have to have a certain number in the United States because of the size of the market here and the regulatory potential? You do have to think about how do I design my study? Where do I allocate my patients to do this work if I've got choices? Because Penny's point, if it's more expensive here, not just for university, but for anyone, even Andrew from IQVIA was talking about this, time they have to spend on public affairs gets harder, and we're all downstream of that. So if all we're doing is at a time of higher innovation and higher demand, increasing friction between the processes and any one of these stakeholders that can't possibly help. Now, and being Pollyanna, maybe coming out of this, we get a brighter, shinier, more effective machine, and go from optimistic about that. But if we do, then good. But in the short term, again, to the point about uncertainty, nobody really knows. And there aren't enough people in those seats, in those key places to call and ask in the way that one could a couple of years ago, 5 years ago. And those relationships too, I mean, this matters as well. You have to have, Ginny, you said this morning, it used to be that you knew people there. And as you're going through a design prior to submission, you can have a conversation. We're thinking about doing it like this, is the way this, and get some consultation and advice. That's just harder.
Yeah. We'll turn it to questions here in just a minute, but before I do that, a question for each of you. What keeps you up at night looking ahead at the next 6 months?
What
Only one
doesn't keep me up at night?
Next 6 days,
gosh. I mean, for me, it's, the lack of predictability and the lack of control, because, we want to influence the process as much as possible. And so there are a lot of decisions that are being made that I think the impacts are not fully understood, and they're actually not being made in line with the goals and objectives that are intended, and that drives me crazy.
Yeah, I think I worry that I'm under-investing in things which would have been sure bets because of uncertainty. And I'm looking at my actual cash inflows and balance sheet and financial performance. I don't actually have reason to be that nervous, but I'm still nervous. And that has implications, even at a very tactical daily level, on what sort of investments we make in our people, which matter to me very much. There are people that we'd like to promote, people we'd like to hire, there are new businesses we'd like to open, maybe to acquire. And even at our business side, we're not a tiny company, but we're not Fortune 500. We're thinking about it more than we probably ought to. And if everyone's doing that, or if we're doing that, and we're representative, then that delimits the amount of economic activity, because we're just not really sure. But there is also just in the very immediate, and I don't imply, I'm not trying to make a political point here at all. We just need the policy to stay where it is. whatever it is. So even if the policy becomes something which I don't think is advantageous, if just stay like that for 24 months, then I know what I'm doing. What worries me day to day, and I'm joking about the next 6 days, but I might come in on Monday and open my phone in the morning, which I know I shouldn't do, is the first thing I do when I wake up. When you open your phone, you see there's been a major policy shift, which maybe makes that investment decision I finally did take a bad one. That's hard. That's not limited to the United States, but right now it's particularly driven by the United States. I feel like I'm very Eeyore-ish this morning, Shaman.
That's okay. We're going to end on a positive note, heading into the weekend. What are you most optimistic about?
I still think, my son is 16. And when he was at dinner a few weeks ago, he said that he'd listened to something or read something that if you think of being on a ship, if all of human history is a ship, we're right at the very front tip, the farthest part forward. And it's, by any objective measure, it's the best time to have been a human in the history of humans. Now, it might not feel like that every day. So I feel like that too in terms of our industry. That we're at the farthest forward edge of what we do. The innovation is better, the science is better, the opportunities are better, the level of education is better, the standard of public health globally is the highest it's ever been, even if it's not as high as we wanted it to be. And hopefully these are short-term squalls that we're talking about. If we can get back on some sort of even keel to flog my ship metaphor, but if we can, the opportunities are enormous. And when I think about what public health is going to look like, or my industry would look like for my kid in 20 years, 30 years' time, when he's getting closer to my age, the advances that you all could make, or that we could make, are astronomical. And I think that's helpful for me to sometimes say, all right, well, yeah, I'm looking at Q3 and it's a mess. But if I think about Q3 of 2048, yeah.
So I think for all of this, you have to have like a part of your brain on steadying the ship, and then a larger part of your brain on looking to the future. And so that's why I'm bullish, is that I think we have incredible talent here at the university, and the work that we're doing is really, really important. And I can just pick any researcher in, this enterprise and look at them and be excited about what they're doing. But we have some really exciting research that is happening and that will have strong impacts. And so that makes me very happy.
Fantastic.
Yes.
Yes. I think we have, I'm looking at our timekeeper, but I think we have a few minutes for some questions. Does anyone in there? Yes.
Hi. Thank you very much. It's really informative. Hi again, Penny. This one is for you. Tell me what your advocacy efforts look like at UNC, either for or against policies or things that are being passed down to you all. Who is kind of representing you all, and what does that look like?
So we have a lot of advocacy happening. I would say a significant part of my time is spent on advocacy. The Chancellor is doing a lot of work. We go up to DC and talk with stakeholders quite often. We have an Office of Federal Affairs here, and they are quite involved. I mentioned that I'm on this national committee for revising the indirect rates. So on my way over here, I was on a call for that, because I am on a call for that in mornings, nights, and weekends. And so we are working with Congress on what we've got bill language, and we've got work that's out there in DC that will hopefully make its way out to the public domain. But this political moment is very fraught, and it is very hard to navigate the political demands of this moment and the sway between these opposing views. So we work very hard, and we spend more time with the majority party and working to get there. And so that's what we've been doing, and I think we've been making an impact. I know we've been making an impact. Where we wind up is an unknown.
Hi, so thank you for everything you've shared today. One thing that I'm curious about, we've talked a lot about research within academic centers and how would you suggest somebody who's in maybe a clinical role that is hired under a clinical specific umbrella, that their employer might not necessarily support them doing research outside of their clinical role? How would you suggest that they maybe move more into that research phase while maintaining their clinical duties?
I think that's really about getting engaged and finding partners, finding collaborators, even if you can't get your hands into work, to just be talking with researchers and identifying paths forward. We have a massive shortage of research administrators, clinical administrators in research spaces. There is more need, and so I think the more you talk to people about those opportunities, you'll find them. The challenge is that nobody ever goes in, I mean, I don't know anybody who goes out into the world and says, I want to be a research administrator. Like, it's not a job that, like, anybody really knows about, but there's a huge infrastructure and a huge market out there for people who are very interested in carrying out research. So the opportunities are there, they're just not necessarily that visible. And so by talking to people in clinical research spaces, you'll learn more and more and be able to get engaged.
I guess let me reshape this a little bit.
Uh-huh.
I'm specifically asking about me. So I am a UNC employee, but I'm hired under the hospital. I work with patients in a specialty setting, and I would love to get my foot a little bit more into using my expertise and my past research to get a little bit more into the research side of UNC, but I'm not hired under the academic center. I'm hired under the hospital.
So you are early, but we have been working on an associated entity that sits in between the healthcare system and the university for more support of clinical trials that happen in the healthcare system, because we're a little behind at UNC. We do a lot of clinical trials, but we don't have a ton of research in the healthcare system itself, and we're gearing up to do that. And so we actually have a group called CRP, Clinical Research Partners, that if you can identify and find, and you're welcome to email me and I can link you to them, but there are undoubtedly opportunities through that entity that is in partnership with the university that is partnered through the healthcare system.
Thank you.
If I may, just outside of, a little bit like Penny said, almost nobody that I know, I think I literally know 3 people who intended to go into clinical research. Most, that route was different. They sort of went into it differently. I would encourage you to look broader than just the system and to the hospital system. There's a tremendous amount of commercial research, especially in this state, so that'd be one. The second would be, and this is what I would say when I used to work here, is that the alumni network is tremendously powerful. So if you went to this school, great, but regardless if you didn't, as you're attached now to the UNC system, I would very much lean on the system here and anywhere that you used to work, and just reach out to people like me, like Jeannie, like Dustin, like maybe you can find, like Dahlia, who's in the front row of me. That's how it works. Right? The job that I got when I first started in clinical research made absolutely no sense. There's no way that I should have been hired for it. And I've been in the industry for 20 years now, so some of it is going to be a little bit of just sleeve up networking. The amount of opportunity is gigantic, and quite honestly, as to Penny's point, we need more people than there are. So I would encourage you to look as broadly as you can, network as widely as you can.
There's also a sneaky way of thinking about what's available, and that is that we have, at the university, we have something called Research for Me, and it's a portal for the public and for patients to look and see if I want to be a participant in a study, you can go in and put in your characteristics, and you can put in if you were desperately looking for cancer therapy, for example, you can type in cancer, and the clinical trials that are happening here that relate to cancer will come up. But if you're interested in kind of what studies are happening, that's a way to back end see what's happening here and identify the people who are running those studies.
Thank you both for being here and sharing your wisdom. So Mark, previously you talked about talent, and I'm a big believer that companies are aren't anything without their talent. And you talked also about, the waking up and looking at the phone and feeling, overwhelmed with what's going on today. So we're in an environment, and we already know this, that's very ambiguous. So I wonder, how do you both center yourselves and your teams when you work through ambiguity?
Well, that's an easy one, Dahlia. I should say too, I had the great privilege of having Dahlia on the STAR team working for us last year. And we're all going to end up working for Dahlia. I said all that just to give me time to think about the depth of your question. So there's the business school answer and there's the parson answer. So I'll give you the parson answer. Right? You have to have other things in your life that you grip on. Be that your family, your partner, your house, your kids, your hobbies. So there's that. They cannot occupy all of your thoughts because it's a doom spiral. You have to be able to find some time to think, whether that's carving out a particular space and also recognizing that there's context, that this might seem like the most dreadful thing in the world between 8 and 10 a.m. But by 3, with a little bit of distance, a little bit more thought, maybe it's not so bad as all that. From a leadership perspective, and this is more of the business school answer for the team, is making sure that the shadow that you cast is the right one. That if they see you panic, the order of magnitude panic from them is considerably greater. Doesn't mean that you always have to be jazz hands and everything's fine. So sometimes it is communicating to them that things aren't great, but here's what we're thinking about it, and here's what we do about it. And then it gets it off that desk to some extent. Like, hey, look, all you need to do today is see 10 patients, draw blood, send to labs. We got you. And sometimes it's given them a little bit more sense of what 3 months, 6 months looks like. You can't do any of that if you yourself are drowning. So I would go back to find your own space, find a way to breathe and think, and have some strategic approach to it, but also give yourself some forgiveness that you can't necessarily have an instantaneous answer to every sort.
So for me, I would say, from the personal perspective, I do think like having the kind of executive time to really think and center yourself. I do that before I start the day, and it's the last thing that I do at the end of the day, and that's important. Slowing down and breathing, just slowing down, period. Really, really important, because you cannot be effective if you're racing through life. But on a team side, what I think is really important in times of uncertainty is to create as much certainty as you can for everybody. And so that translates to transparency. And so what we've done here, not just with my team, but with the broader university community, is that I've held town halls. I was holding them weekly. Starting in January, now they're more monthly. But the town halls have the same formula. It's got the key players. It's got me. It has the lead for operations, legal, federal affairs, the 4 of us. And basically what we do is we say, this is what we know now, this is what we don't know, and this is what we're doing. And it's just those 3 kind of basic categories of facts. And what that does for the community is when there is a lot of uncertainty, there's a lot of misinformation. And misinformation was the biggest problem for us in the beginning and probably still continues to be. But if you can get rid of the misinformation, because the misinformation is always negative, always catastrophe, always bad. And so the more you can get rid of that, the better.
I'll add a little bit of my own perspective to that. One of the wisest things a former mentor, or that I've ever picked up from a mentor, was really this idea that there are people who work in very, very intense and emergency situation environments, and most of us are not those people. And so we have the luxury of pausing and taking those breaths and really giving thought and discernment to our actions, and if we have that luxury, we should take it. I think the other piece for me with the team, in addition to all the things that both of you shared, and I agree, communicate again, and then communicate again, But I also really try to make sure that even if I'm not able to put it down at 6 o'clock or over the weekend, that the team is, and really respecting those boundaries, that family time, because the healthier they are, the better overall our work environment is going to be. And if everyone is feeling like they're on call 24/7, there's just a increase to that, fight or flight sense across the whole team, that nervous systems can't calm down. That doesn't make for wise decision making and good strategic direction.
I also want to add to the transparency communication is that we started doing these town halls like the same week that the news broke about the indirect rates. And my peers at other institutions did not do that. And they didn't do it because they felt it introduced risk. And they were worried about, would the administration see or hear what they were saying? Would they get in trouble with their boards? Would they get in trouble with their community? And I weighed those two things and said, it's better to communicate. And so I think that's important because there is risk in being transparent, but I think you have to, weigh every situation appropriately.
Yes.
I heard you speak. Thank you for being here and for sharing with us. I heard you say earlier that nobody sets out to be a research administrator. But I am an administrator, not a research one. But one of the things that my team has run into is the problem of high turnover with research coordinators and administrators, and the lack of research administrators prohibiting and causing issues with clinical research, and that being a problem with them and having it stifle and having them not be able to participate in clinical trials and clinical research because of not having that support. So with a talent pipeline that you have, is there not a way to have that pipeline created for that role? Is there not some way to build that out? Because there is a severe lack of that kind of support, and should that not be a career path and one that is highly regarded?
Yeah, I mean, we definitely have programs to do this. And I will say this is not just an issue at this university, this is an issue across the whole country. But I think the best thing we can do is to partner with industry, to partner and to create programs that really are mutually beneficial to industry and to us. And where we've done that, it's been incredibly effective. We just need more of those.
It can be a good problem in the sense that, so every private company that I've worked in, we've had some version of a partnership training program for clinical research staff, whether they be coordinators or CRAs or clinical study managers, to try and build that pipeline. But though I say that can be a good problem, ordinarily there's turnover because they're going to do something else. So they might be leaving the university to go work at IQVIA or somewhere like that, which creates a space. And it sounds like there might be a problem and a solution between the back row and the front row over here. So there is more that we could do. And that comes back a little bit to the earlier discussion about infrastructure and investment. When I say that people, I was being slightly glib, I don't know people who did research on purpose. They wanted to do science for sure. They wanted to do medicine for sure. They didn't necessarily see themselves working for Roche, running a phase 3 cardiovascular program. They got into that by accident. But your point is a good one. And I think even just conversations like this in multidisciplinary centers between the business school, between the School of Innovation, between the School of Pharmacy and the medical school will help. But I think there is actually more of a pipeline than maybe it looks like, and hopefully the colleagues are finding something good to go to.
I got the yellow. Oh, now I got the pink card. Please come up and ask your questions of the panel afterwards. I know we didn't get to everyone. And help me to thank Penny and Mark.